Forum for a New Central is a special series that we launched 2 weeks ago. It will take place over the next 6 months, and we are focused on the future of the city as we shape our districts and prioritize our waterfront. The area of Central, our city's historic and primary CBD, has long been an important hub for commerce and culture. It is now being tested like never before as business continues to decentralize and ongoing public health restrictions and social unrest threaten to further erode its role in the life of the city. As an area ripe for reinvention and innovation, please join us for this unique series of in-person and virtual events against the backdrop of a public exhibition. As a prelude to today's conference, yesterday we held a workshop for 20 participants where we debated and discussed opportunities and challenges for future-proofing Central. We developed a few key recommendations along 3 topics. How might we cultivate inclusive cities, inclusive spaces within this city? How might we cultivate pedestrianization and walkability? And finally, how might we connect old and new fabrics for everyone? These topics and others will be highlighted and explored further during today's session with Nigel Smith. So without further ado, take it away, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. I think there's a huge amount of history still left in Central. There are a number of key landmarks that are effectively connected by a wonderful maze of footbridges, underpasses, and alleyways and streets. Over time, this has gently mixed into the old and the new parts of Central, and through an unweb plan of public and private partnerships. But there are certainly a number of challenges that we need to face. May I have my first slide, please? Well, first and foremost, yes, Central is still the heart of the financial centre of Hong Kong, and it will remain that for a number of years to come. But it's morphed also, in a way, into an entertainment and cultural district, you could say, that really naturally mixes commerce and culture. But what we feel, though, that there's something missing, and it's really missing in terms of the synergies that are holding it back through these challenges. It's effectively a collection of sporadic destinations that have almost been overshadowed by congestion, which really simply says it needs greater connectivity. So what is culture and commerce, and are they really going to collide in Central? Well, yes, they do, and no, they don't. If you think about it, the commerce side is sort of business, but that drives profitability. Cultural is heritage, which drives preservation. And the community overall drives the protection of the urban realm and the environment. If you think about it, the wider CBD is enormous, but if we just focus on core Central and we look at the different areas, thank you, we see that it's really a cluster of rings. And those rings create dynamic nodes. And if we can understand the history of those nodes, then we can create a narrative, much like Freedom Trail in Boston. We want the people to be able to let it speak to them, and then it can speak to the wider community. So what are the challenges? And unfortunately, I'm going to be relatively negative to start with. It's easy to blame transportation, but I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to start. And that's the fundamental problem. But it's also about a mindset and a desire to change, and a vision and a holistic thinking that we really need to embrace as the public in a partnership together with the government. We've got to break down these siloed mentality of the different departments and also embrace the key stakeholders who to date haven't really been incentivized to do anything more than just think about their individual plots. And so I'd like to sort of use the analogy that it's much like a forest. We can't really see the wood for the trees. We need to take more of a holistic viewpoint. And that's where we need to start in terms of those opportunities. We need to recalibrate and reconnect through better pedestrian and walkability. And there's been a number of studies on that, but what we're not getting is the color back into Central. If we open up the alleyways and embrace the artisans, as one professional said to me, Central is alive in the alleyways with the art shops, coffee houses, old restaurants and cobblers. And I think that's a great way to think about the flats of Central. But we've got to let the people freely explore them. And at the moment, we just feel too penned in. So we have to ask ourselves, how livable is Central? And if you think about one of the 3 tenets of the Hong Kong 2030 Plus study, it was all about livability. And it's about putting the pedestrian first. We need to consider mobility needs, much as Athens did many years ago, and look at the successes that they're having now today. Retail is also changing, and we need to see the interface between retail and also entertainment, and how that then interfaces itself with the financial sector and what is the heart of the business nature of Central. It will really come down to, space utilization for the residents and the business workers. Of course, the harbourfront is going to be our greatest asset, and I think Site 3 is going to be the major connector, and is the most important thing we can do right now to put the fun back into the harbourfront, and the fun and the heritage back into Central. But it needs a vision. It needs some sort of joint public-private community, an initiative much like we did on the Tsim Sha Tsui waterfront, and that works extremely well. So if we can open up, we can connect, we can then revitalize the commercial areas. And that's the nub of what I'm trying to say today. Well, if we look at connectivity in a little bit more focus, what we're starting to see is a bit of a north-south divide. Actually, if you think about it, Central is Hong Kong's largest transport interchange. It's got everything, if you think about it. It's got ferries, it's got the Airport Express, it's got buses, so public transportation and private cars. And now with the Wan Chai bypass, it allows a lot more accessibility along the waterfront. But what becomes the issue is really moving across into, as we call them, the flats of Central, the initial reclaimed areas, and some of those alleyways that I referred to earlier. And it's really that ground plane and the streetscape that's equally important for the pedestrians, but yet once you get across the footbridges on Connaught Road, nothing seems to happen. We get congested and bolted in, penned in, as I said earlier. And Dever Road, of course, is the greatest example of what not to do and how we need to change. So how can we bring back the old city contrasts into a new world? Well, there's a number of ways we need to do that. We need to regenerate the urban realm. We need to look at some of the squares and the areas that are unused and untapped and open them up to the public, as I said earlier. It comes back to traffic, I'm afraid. We can't just ignore it. It's going to choke Hong Kong, and it's going to choke Central ultimately. So this has to be a first mover opportunity. We've got to somehow move the transportation to the North Shore, create some form of concourse that's then connected by more footbridges, for sure, that then gets us down onto a better street plane. We will need to think about, but I don't want to discuss today, an electronic pricing system for cars. We need to think about both public transport and private car usage. It's increased far too much over the last decade. And how can we still allow access for some, but really clear out the way for many others? Now, this is not going to happen immediately. So let's think about a 5 or a 10-year plan here. I think everybody's jumped onto, we must change tomorrow, change our mindsets right now. Well, I think mindsets will change. A lot's gone on in the last couple of years. We're having to reboot ourselves, as Richard said this morning. But I think if we start to take more of a 5 or 10-year plan, then it becomes realistic. It becomes achievable. Which really brings us on to smart cities. Now, if you think about it, smart cities is not just about technology. Smart cities are about how the environment can focus and bring together livability, sustainability, and, most important, resilience. That's what I've effectively been talking about. That brings into focus, again, mobility. Mobility of the pedestrian now. We've got to focus on that. We've already moved, or we've got a plan to move the transportation, let's assume. Now, how can we leverage some of those underground spaces, increase the number of footbridges, particularly across Connaught and Dever roads, get people down onto the flats, and then, as they can, up through the Shelley Street escalator, up into the hills and the residences. In doing so, we're going to create really a thematic centres of attention in a walkable network that ultimately sets the CBD limits. And by widening Central and making it more accessible and pleasant, we'll be able to combine livable city with sustainable city and a smart city as they work in conjunction. So ultimately, we need more adaptive ways to think and a vision to achieve, and really to look at what are the total solutions we want, and then set milestones. Part of this, as you can see from the map, will be wayfinding. It's very congested. There are a number of different bubbles and corridors that are forming, but it's still very hard to move around. How do we actually tell people about the history? How do we get them into different parts that they haven't seen before? Well, again, it comes back to a 10-year strategy. Focus on the end goal so that we can make it happen. There has been a lot of talk in the past, certainly at an event that I ran in January, about BIZs, Business Improvement Zones. And here's the really question. Is it the solution for Central? Is it going to work? And I can't answer that question today. All I can do is really look at the pros and the cons. But what it will do is bring into light more of that vision and a holistic view that we talked about earlier. It stops us fighting around the edges. We need to bring together the Transport Department and the district councillors to work out a solution. But that isn't enough in itself. It's got to come from the top. Ultimately, the CE has to put it into her policy address. We have to drive it down and connect those departments. Ultimately, we want to bring together the artisans and the hawkers, get them back into the flats, make it more lively, clean it out. It's far too dirty at the moment. So that's going to have to come from multi-department cooperation and a clear directive and vision. If I go back to the Hong Kong 2030 Plus plan, really the main tenet there was creating a livable city, albeit that we live in a high-density city. These were a number of the items that they talked about, but what I want to think about is how do we create in Central a sense of place? How can we regenerate, as I said earlier, Statute Square? What else could we do with the old Legco building and around there, and even Chater Gardens? How can we reinforce perhaps a sense of contrast and care towards some of those old lanes, but at the same time respecting the need for smart cities, advancement, technology, finance, connectivity. Connectivity within, the realms of just the three great landmarks that we have in terms of PMQ, Tai Kwun, and soon to be Central Market, and how those connect together. But it's not just about those three, is it? It's about a multitude of destinations and historical sites that we can open up. If we just improve the areas to get into and out of Lan Kwai Fong as the entertainment district and how that connects across, both on the east-west and the north-south perspectives. This will then deliver a mix of uses that really balances that commerce and culture and open up and create new spaces that causes really more of a dynamic sense of animation. Of course, if we step back and think now, what are the opportunities for Central in the greater picture of Hong Kong and the Greater Bay Area? Well, I've talked about changing mindsets. I've talked about getting a vision and a clear timeline. And I've talked about it coming from the top. Those are three key deliverables that we need to focus on. Central will remain the heart of Hong Kong and a cultural and commercial hub. Does the commercial areas and culture collide? Well, yes, a little bit, but I think that's okay. That's the cheekiness of Central. That's what we want to explore and open up. But, let's face it, if we don't do something now, we're going to end up in an oblivion of wasted opportunities. And that's not what should happen. I think we need to make that change now, and here is a great starting point. With that, I'll pass back to you, Tiffany, and we can have an open discussion.
Thank you, Nigel. You've really provided us a lot of food for thought here. I really appreciate all the work you put into that presentation. I agree that the time is now. It seems like there's a real sense of urgency, finally, maybe. And looking deep into what those challenges and opportunities are for us here in Central, but also thinking beyond that. I'm glad you set the scene as well as our context within the GBA. That's something to think about too. But when it comes to taking this holistic view, we don't still have a mechanism in place to help ourselves do that and to collaborate. So you bring up the concept of BIZs or community improvement zones, business improvement districts, however you want to call them. why do we still not have an entity like that in Hong Kong?
Because it's a misunderstanding between the public and private partnerships, ultimately. We need to somehow get the owners of some of these buildings in a district to get together. They're not doing that at the moment. They're thinking too individualistically. It can be done. I gave Tsim Sha Tsui as an example. I think it worked very well there, and other cities around the world. We need a new narrative. So if they can understand the narrative, then they'll see what the value is. No one's seen the true value yet, and I think that's the problem.
Yeah, I actually agree with that, especially in Central, when you think about how rich our history is here. This has always been that primary place where the commerce and culture are colliding, as you said. That narrative is really interesting, and people should know about it more. So maybe it starts with a branding exercise. I don't know.
Yep.
But I don't want to forget that, again, within the context of the GBA, what are your thoughts on what role Central can play when it comes to powering the region as still a place that endures?
Well, if we play to our strengths, then the financial hub of Hong Kong is going to play into the Greater Bay Area ultimately. And we need to make sure that that happens. Now, infrastructure is going to be key. And we know that the connectivity in that last map that I showed from Central all the way up to Qianhai is going to be there in several years' time. So I think if we grow then the area around Central, that's why an earlier slide looked at a larger CBD. We can't just focus in on core Central anymore. I think we really need to look at what have we got from Sheung Wan to Wan Chai, Causeway Bay even. And then through that, we look at the real estate. We need to grow the real estate. There was a lot of talk earlier about footprints, of course, but at the end of the day, we will see an increase in PRC demand. So now there's a new level of connectivity. And what is it that the PRC companies want out of Central? And how do they see leveraging Central themselves back into the Greater Bay Area?
Great. I guess one final point about, you mentioned the waterfront and Site 3, and oftentimes this is a bit of an elephant in the room for our members who are watching that site very closely. But what would you say is a great outcome for Site 3? What would you want to see there?
Something quite unique, which is so easy to say, isn't it? First of all, let's go back to the basics, a connector. It's got to connect the waterfront back into Central. So somehow there's got to be wide walkways and a new public realm that incorporates this retail entertainment aspect. Secondly, the structure itself needs to be mind-bogglingly amazing. It's on one of the most incredible shorelines of the world. We need to have our own destination. We tried that and started it with the exhibition center, but we haven't followed on. Now, time has gone by, so that's okay. This is our last opportunity almost. But then finally, I would say, how does that then link in with the rest of the waterfront? It needs to be re-energized, as I said earlier on. We need to bring the fun back into it. And the heritage is in core Central, but in the northern side, where the transport is, then we need to start bringing the people and mixing them in a different way and take that holistically, but ultimately bringing back the fun.
Well, thank you so much, Nigel. Thanks for joining us today for this special installment. And keep your eye on Forum for a New Central in the coming months, and join us again soon. Thank you.